Welcome to A Cup of Comfort with me, Trish Laub. This show is about care hero topics that nobody wants to talk about. Perhaps you tended to a younger sibling's cut finger or babysat a neighbor's child. Maybe you were thrown into the fire and became a care hero during a medical crisis. You may care for a parent, spouse, sibling, a child, or a friend, but the challenges are the same. Getting the tools you need to navigate the maze of unfamiliar options can be overwhelming. I know. I have been there. I didn't even know what I didn't know. I am here to help you with all of it. No care hero topic is off limits. I'm here to share with you concise, actionable information, as well as my fresh perspective about Alzheimer's and providing dignified care through the end of life for anyone with a life-altering diagnosis. So grab a cup of your favorite beverage, sit back, and let me help you on your care hero journey. We will talk and share, we may laugh, and we may share a tear or two. And we will always share a cup of comfort. Welcome to A Cup of Comfort with me, Trish Laub. I'm here today with Robert Pardi, a former guest, and he is here today to have a conversation about the importance and the value of conversations with people who inspire us. So, Robert, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, hello, everybody, first of all. So just in terms of like stories and people that inspire us, I'm actually here with Trish.
Live.
We met over LinkedIn basically 9 months ago or something like that. And she is a very inspirational woman. And I've learned a lot just knowing her. So we've been talking about this idea of stories. And I'm lucky enough, I actually have to say that I'm really fortunate enough to live in Italy. And one of the things that I've realized about the lifestyle in Italy is it's so much about people talking with each other, talking to each other. It's not talking at each other. And it all takes place in the piazza, which is why if you saw the intro to this, we talk about the piazza, because it's when we share our stories, and we've experienced this ourselves, but we not just between ourselves, but also during events which asked us to show up in a different way, asked us to show our resilience, our grit, our strength, our vulnerability. And what I realized personally, and then we realized we both shared this, is that we had to leverage the stories that we overheard throughout our life that inspired us from people that we admired. Today, there's something about comparison, right? We live in a world of comparison. And we forget a lot about admiration. You know, we can compare ourselves, which comes from something from lack, but admiration is something from growth. And before I go into sort of where I come from and the events that happened in my life and why I chose to grab those stories, let's say, I just let Trish chime in a little bit about, you know, her experience as well, because you had two amazing parents, right?
I did. And, you know, a lot of my life choices were based on stories they told, or stories they told me about my grandparents. And Robert and I have talked about this. I really feel that storytelling is something that has been lost in the United States in particular. You know, we come from a kind of tribal culture. Some of our Native American history was very much around the campfire. And in fact, it was a couple of days ago that we were fortunate enough to find a big campfire, and there were all these people around it, and nobody knew each other, and they were swapping stories. And it just really fueled this idea of the piazza and the value of the stories that people have to share. And like Robert said, you know, it's not just my parents, it's my friends, it's Ben Robert, who have provided me with their stories. And it's not that they're telling them to teach me, it's just that I hear them and I go, oh, okay. You know, and it inspires me maybe to take a step I wouldn't have taken.
Exactly.
So, you know, I'm sure that the people that are listening have they think back, they can remember a story of somebody's that really made that difference in their life.
And that's exactly what it is. First, what she's talking about. So we were in some mountain town somewhere and it started snowing. It's October, but that's okay. And we were just about to get in the car and I saw smoke coming from some corner somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I said we had to go over and see what the smoke was, because I noticed it was a fire. And in the piazza where I live in a very small town in Italy, which is around 900 people. In the winter, they light fires to keep you warm while you're outside. But what is this idea of piazza, and why are we talking about stories? And the idea of all of it really is, the piazza is a place where through storytelling, you realize that you are not alone, that what you've gone through is something someone else has gone through. And this idea of the importance of stories, which the other side of it, someday maybe we'll talk about it, the stories we tell ourselves, which can really stop us from doing things. But what this is all about is talking about those stories that actually inspired us, that we could draw upon that. I actually live in the same town my great-grandfather came from. That guy got on a boat for Italy. He had $9 in his pocket. And I guess in the early 1900s, $9 was reasonable. He spoke a little English, but he set out for a new adventure. And I was actually blessed to know him as a child because he lived a very long life. Some of the stories he told about overcoming those things, or, having to learn a new language and build a life, that stayed with me. And I was able to think about that when I needed to recreate my life, and just people that have heard us speak before. I was married to an amazing woman for almost 20 years, knew her for 24. She passed away after an 11-year battle with breast cancer. And that required a lot of strength that, you're not necessarily born with those skills, but you see those skills throughout your life if you focus on those people that you admire. And I was able to look at that. I grew up in a very difficult relationship with an alcoholic dad, but yet there were people that helped me through that and taught me a lot about my strength. So what we want to do is we want to focus a little bit on that. So, for example, I had 13 years old, or maybe 12, maybe. I worked for this really difficult woman. And it sounds crazy I worked, but I actually did, because back then, you could. Your mother just had to sign a form. And she was an old Italian woman that had a fruit stand. And she was so strong, and her husband died when she was very young, and she built this business out of nothing. And the stories she would tell me about how she built that and respect for people. I remember somebody coming in, not having enough of money to pay for some of the groceries, and I was at the cash register. And I didn't realize the dynamic that was going on, but she came over and told the woman that, it's okay, don't worry about it. And the man behind then paid for her. And I asked her, I said, well, why didn't you just say that man was paying for her? And he said, well, because she was an older woman and she would have been embarrassed. But as the owner, I could give that to her. And that was just something that allowed me to understand empathy, right? That was one of those stories of empathy. I had an amazing grandmother, my paternal grandmother. She knows her very well by now, even though she passed away many, many years ago. And her name was Mary. She was Grandma Fella to me when I was a kid, because she called me Fella. And then she became Crazy Mary because the whole family thought she was crazy, because she would live her life regardless of, let's say, those generational programmings we have. She grew up as an Italian American woman, where technically, let's say her role way back then was to take care of the home and have children and cook and clean. And her husband passed away before I was even born. So I didn't know my grandfather, but I knew the great grandfather. And she didn't know how to drive, but she'd get on a bus and she would travel around the country and she would go see different things. And it was so unusual for that point of time. But she said, live like a gypsy. Life has so many possibilities, has so much to offer you. And I had to harness that story. I had to harness the story of my great grandfather. I had to harness actually the story of that Italian woman. Her name was Fanny, by the way. And that helped me recreate my life. My wife, who was amazing, I watched her pursue her dreams. And despite having metastatic breast cancer, she became the founding director of palliative care at New York Hospital. And after she passed away, and I went back to what I knew, it was a comfort zone. I went back to finance. I went back to the lifestyle I knew. I wasn't living my dream. I wasn't living a passion. And I just said to myself one day, but wait a minute, what am I doing? I saw this woman achieve so much. That's a story that I witnessed. And harnessing that allowed me to pull out strength that was latent inside me, because a lot of the times we have so much inside us, but yet we may be focusing on stories of failure or stories that just impede us in general. But there are so many people that in our lives have achieved amazing things. If you just think of even single moms, wow, like really. I also, unfortunately, I knew women with metastatic breast cancer who their husbands divorced them because the husband couldn't deal with everything that comes with that. And those women thrived. I mean, it was incredible. So that's, I think.
Well, I want to kind of add on to that, because there are the stories of people that we admire. And when Robert and I are talking about this, we're not talking about celebrities. We're talking about everyday people we know, people that we want to hear from. But there's also kind of the stories, sharing the stories that help people. For example, caregiving. I mean, Robert and I have both been in the caregiving arena. We still are there, but one kind of that sharing is the caregiving stories. The people that have a specific diagnosis, or the people that are care heroes. I mean, those are the inspirational stories too, that they help you get through, not necessarily, I mean, there's the big jump life decisions, but then there's the everyday, how do I just get through the next 5 minutes? And you can relate to the person. I'm old enough that I grew up in an era where people didn't share a lot. They didn't share their stories. They didn't talk. Like I said, storytelling is just now coming back in the United States. And a couple events when I was in maybe my 20s, I happened to just say that this was going on. And all of a sudden there was this whole community of people who had collective stories. They were individual, but it was the collective story, the power of that. And that's really what Robert and I are talking about as well. It's a specific kind of storytelling. So and then, as he mentioned, there's the stories we tell ourselves, which we can address at some point as well. I'm going to we're going to take a quick break here.
Okay.
So we'll be right back. We have been talking about the value of the stories that people that we admire share and how they affect our lives.
And Trish said something before the break. She sort of mentioned it twice, right? About storytelling in America, which I think it's amazing because it's really becoming accepted again, almost, because you said
there's a resurgence of it.
Yeah, there's a resurgence. There was a point in time that people weren't sharing anymore. And this is that whole idea of the piazza, right? She mentioned before, we're tribal. We are tribal in nature. We need to belong. But part of what creates belonging is actually sharing those stories. We need to connect, and it's not just sharing our views, but we've all gone through things. And Trish mentioned also earlier about when we're talking about people we admire or have inspired us, it's the people around us. It's not necessarily, and again, because I mentioned Instagram in the past, it's not these big celebrities, let's say. I see inspiration all the time through the people that I connect to and I talk to, and not just my clients or people that have had disease, but every single person, by sharing a story in and of itself, that's admirable, because it's very hard to be vulnerable.
Right.
We've spoken in the past about vulnerability is very difficult, because we think that we're supposed to show up strong and we're supposed to wear armor. And when we put all of this on top of us, we're not really engaged in life. We're engaged in a character we're sort of playing. And when we allow vulnerability and surrender are tied, but when we step into who we are, we can only really accept our uniqueness when we step into that vulnerability. And a lot of the stories, I think you would say as well, of those people we admire, is they stepped in front of us saying, this is what I'm going through, and this is how I'm dealing with it. And all of a sudden there is this deeper connection, but there's also this strength, right? Because first of all, if you think about vulnerability in and of itself, you can't really live an experience if you're not willing to step into this experience. And when you've spoken to someone that has been through the experience, all of a sudden you realize you can come out the other side. Like they've been through the experience, or they're going through the experience, but they're saying, hey, I'm walking on coals right now, and so it's just go do it type thing, right?
I think, I agree with you completely. I think that the vulnerability aspect of it, for me anyway, releases once you share that story. It's no longer a secret. Secrets have weight. So it's not that it's a secret really, but it's something that you've carried. And once you're vulnerable and share that, someone else is sharing that with you in a way. It also, I think for me, when I've seen people share their stories that might have been very difficult, it's given me permission to be okay with sharing mine.
Exactly.
So it's very powerful in many, many directions.
It's very powerful in many directions. And, there's so much discussion about a million different things that, we could be speaking for hours, but we, all of us, not just Trish and I, but everybody, every one of you that's listening right now, you're a content creator. If you really think about it, this idea of, having a podcast, having a blog, and all of these other things. Yes, those are content creators, but our mothers and fathers, our friends, the rest of our family, our colleagues are all content creators. And that's actually the real legacy we leave. Right? Because our stories. Right. So because people build upon them, people use them. That's where, again, we talk about this idea of stories. If this was interactive, I'd be asking who are the people you admire? How have they indirectly led to some maybe transformation in your life, or growth, or certain stories helped you get through certain things? Like I said, I think about my grandmother all the time. I think about my wife all the time as well. But I think about a lot of these people because, and maybe if you think about like teachers, there's certain teachers that had a big impact on you, and not necessarily because they were, friendly, but there was a story that took place. So like I mentioned a few people in my life, and Trish has been, very open with me. She's told me a lot of things about her mom and dad, and her mom in the early 60s, right?
Mhm.
Started an international business from
From
home. From home.
Yeah. Talk about being motivated by your mother. Yeah, definitely. I mean, nobody was doing that. People weren't working at home. They weren't doing international things. She was a woman. All those elements completely shaped my concept of the possibilities for me.
I was glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I was glad you brought
possibilities, his word.
Okay. Possibilities is completely my word.
Life-changing though.
But that's the whole idea, right? Those
Mhm.
stories, those stories where we admire or we see, it shows us that there are unlimited possibilities. Whether a business succeeds or fails or everything like that, her mother's stepping forward and attempting, and she and I have this thing about attempting, trying. So we don't use the word try here. Okay, there's a big difference. We don't use the word try. We're using the word attempt. And her mom attempting this business.
Yeah.
That story opens up a world of possibilities because it is there in that moment that there is the ability to be creative, approach things with curiosity, step off the path. And a lot of what we learned, I think, through caregiving as well, is it's a transformational moment for everyone involved, because illness is not just owned by the patient, the person going through it. It is a family disease. Regardless of it, it is a family journey. And that's where I think, first, that's where we connected, but that alone, the stories that you're using to actually approach something like that are extremely important. My wife and I lived an amazingly joyful, full life because we harnessed stories of living life and not letting the disease be the focal point of our life and living in the moment. But when I look back on it, and the reason we wanted to do this, because of both we're in the caregiving space, but not in the caregiving space, was the fact how important those stories were to me. And then you had similar things.
Well, you had Grandma Fella.
I had Grandma Fella.
Many other people too, but she was an explorer. She was joyful. She lived life to the fullest. So, and maybe it would have been the same without her, but I doubt it.
No, I'm 100%. I doubt it. 100%. And this is where I talk about those different stories, right? Because I decided to focus on the Grandma Fella side of the story, right? But I understand my dad was very unhappy in his life, and he found life very difficult and stressful. And that concept of life was happening to him instead of for him. Or the other one is that, he was being used by life instead of using life. Grandma Fella was on the other side. She was using life, right? She was having a blast. She was having a blast. So, there again is the story on what you're focusing on. And so I think a lot of what we see through our connection, but also what we've seen through our different journeys is that idea of the piazza, right? Where people share their stories and you feel that connection to other people that may have been going through those things. There was, if you think of when the piazzas were created, right? There was no... there was no social media, no CNN. You found out the stories that were happening in the town. So I think
absolutely. And I'll share pretty quickly, because we're going to kind of come to the end of time pretty soon. But I shared with Robert that I had an experience with a project that was started in the Netherlands called the Human Library, and I got to be a human book and bring my story into a library, and people checked me out with a little library card. And they had 30 minutes or whatever of my time to ask questions. And that really started me thinking about this as well. I mean, it's been all these different pieces, talking to Robert, having that experience, that this was just something that we talked about, that we wanted to bring out to an audience. And, it's everyday people. It's just, we're everyday people.
Yes.
So, definitely. And we have like another minute. You want to say anything else?
Sure. So no, I wanted to go to back to just this idea, the piazza, right? Because we use that title for this, and the piazza really is all about coming together and sharing stories. And if we can find a place where we can all share stories that positively impact, that show possibility.
Right.
That's, I think,
it's powerful.
It's powerful. It's one of the greatest gifts I think that can exist.
I do too. And I would love to be a part of recreating that.
And so
we will be starting the piazza. This is the last episode of A Cup of Comfort. I want to thank everybody for coming and sharing about Care Heroes. And it's still just as valuable as it was before. But this is the last episode, and sometime in 2020, Robert and I.
2022.
Oh, geez. Not COVID year. 2022. Thank you. Check back at Transformational Talk Radio's website. You can find me at trishlaub.com.
And you can find me at robertpardi.com.
And we will post information when we have a launch date and all that. And we both hope that you and your friends come meet us in the piazza.
Yeah, because we want to bring some great admirable stories. Yes.
We have lots and lots of stories to share. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to A Cup of Comfort with me, Trish Laub, and for your Care Hero courage. Tune in next time on Transformation Talk Radio as we explore life-changing Care Hero topics to assist you on your journey. In the meantime, I would love to hear any tips or insights that you've taken away with you today. So head on over to trishlaub.com. That's Trish Laub, L-A-U-B as in boy.com, and leave a comment, a question you would like answered, or a topic you'd like to hear about in the future. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to my newsletter. So raise a cup and let's toast to all the amazing Care Heroes out there giving it their all. Until next time, remember that you are true heroes.